Hi, Westridge. It's Mrs. Reed from the library. I am your guest reader today, and I will be starting on chapter 9 in our book. Chapter 9 is called The Mountain. Roz was stumping her way up the mountain. Dense forest, rocky outcrops forced the robot to zig and zag and backtrack. But after an hour of steady hiking, she arrived at the mountain peak. Grasses and flowers and shrubs sprouted from every pocket of soil, but there were no trees at the top. Roz was safe from those annoying pine cones. She dusted herself off and then carefully climbed up a leaning slab of stone to the very highest point of the entire mountain. The robot slowly turned her head completely around, and she saw ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction. And in that moment, Roz learned that what you and I had known since the beginning of the story. In that moment, Roz finally realized she was on an island. Roz looked down and surveyed the island. Starting from the sandy southern point, the island grew wider and greener and hillier until it finally jutted up into the rocky cone of the mountain. In some places, the mountain fell away, leaving sheer cliffs. A waterfall rushed off one cliff and fed a river and wound its way through a great meadow in the center of the island. The river flowed past wildflowers and ponds and boulders and then disappeared into the forest. Can you imagine this wonderful island that she's on and all of these things that she has seen for the first time? Blurry shapes suddenly cut through the robot's vision. She refocused her eyes and she saw vultures circling up above the foothills. And then she noticed lizards warming themselves on a distant rock. A badger peeked out from a berry bush, and a moose waded through a stream. A flock of sparrows turned in perfect unison above the trees. The island was teeming with life, and now it had a new kind of life, a strange life, and artificial life. Chapter 10, The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz had no idea how she had come to be on that island. She didn't know that she'd been built in a factory and stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean on a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating on the waves for days until it finally washed ashore. She didn't know she had accidentally been activated by those curious little otters. And as the robot looked out at the island, it never occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. Roz stood on the peak and watched the sun sink behind the ocean. She watched the shadows spread over the island and up the mountainside. She watched the stars come out one by one until the sky was filled with a million points of light. It was the first night of the robot's life. She activated her headlights, and suddenly bright shafts of light were beaming out of her eyes and illuminating the whole mountaintop. Too bright! So she dimmed them, which means she made them a little bit darker. And then she turned them off and she sat in the darkness and listened to the chorus of nighttime chirps. Some of you may have been camping before and you hear all of those sounds in the night. That's what Roz is hearing for the first time. After a while, our robot's computer brain decided it was a good time to conserve energy. So she sat and anchored her hands on to the rocks. Her non-essential programs switched off, and then in her own way, the robot slept. Chapter 12, The Storm. Roz felt safe on the mountaintop, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed one afternoon when a low-flying cloud crept up the mountain and Roz found herself surrounded by white. When the world faded back into view, she noticed more clouds floating past the island, and then she heard a deep rumble behind her. A deep rumble. I wonder what that is. The robot turned her head around and saw that the sky was filled with a swirling wall of darkness. Lights flickered here and there, more deep rumbles. A storm was approaching. And it wasn't just any storm. It was as fierce as one that had sent the cargo ship to the ocean floor. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain tapped on the rowboat. It was time to go. Roz unclamped her hands and began sliding down the peak. Hot sparks flew from her body, where her body scraped against the leaning slab of stone. As soon as her feet hit the soil, she was off and running. The rain fell harder. The wind blew faster. The lightning flashed brighter. The thunder cracked louder. So much rainwater was falling and rushing, rivers of runoff started springing up everywhere. Roz splashed down the mountain, searching through the gloom for any kind of shelter. But she should have watched where she was going. Her heavy feet slipped and tripped, and she tumbled right into the mudslide. Can you imagine what's happening in your head? She tripped, and now she's in all of that mud. Our robot was helpless. The river of mud whisked her downhill, slamming her into rocks and dragging her through bushes and sweeping her straight towards a cliff. Mud was pouring off the cliff like a waterfall. Roz frantically clawed at the ground, grasping for anything she could hold on to. But the flow only carried her faster towards the edge. And just as she was about ready to plunge over the side, she came to a hard and sudden stop. Mud surged all around her, spraying into her face and pinning her against some solid thing. She blindly felt with her hands and recognized the thick roots of a trunk. The trunk of a tree, a pine tree. In an instant, she was pulling herself up into the branches. The wind whipped across the mountainside, and Roz heard the familiar thunk of pine cones pelting her body. But she didn't mind them. She was just happy to be safe from that mud flow. The robot locked arms and legs around the tree and waited for the storm to blow over. Can you just picture her hugging onto that tree for dear life and being just so glad that she's not sliding in all of that mud and rain now? Oh, I can't wait to hear what happens tomorrow. Bye, Westridge.